In recent years, political campaigns have become ridiculously expensive. Indeed, according to data from the Center for Responsive Politics and the Federal Elections Commission, about $5.5 billion was spent by all sources in the 2020 presidential election campaign. And this amount has regularly increased over time. In the 1972 elections, the real total campaign spending was about $500 million, less than 10% of the 2020 amount. But where does all this money come from, and what rules govern how it can be collected and spent? That's what we're going to explore in this video. Campaign funds for political candidates and parties come from a variety of sources, each playing a distinct role in financing of political campaigns, especially in the United States. Individual contributions from private citizens are the single most important source of funding for most campaigns, often representing between half and three-quarters of total campaign funding. This includes both small-dollar donors and large contributors. Individual contributions are subject to limits imposed by the Federal Elections Commission, which can restrict how much an individual can contribute directly to a candidate, a party, committee, or a political action committee during an electoral cycle. Individual contributions are often collected and bundled together by another person. This person, called a bundler, essentially acts as an intermediary between the donors and the campaign. And successful bundlers can have a strong influence in political campaigns and are often rewarded with ambassadorships or other political appointments if the campaign is successful. Political action committees, often called PACs, are organizations formed to pool political campaign contributions from members and donate them to campaigns for or against candidates, ballot initiatives, and legislation. There are limits on how much PACs can contribute directly to a campaign or party. PACs usually play a more significant role in congressional campaigns than in presidential ones, but they can account for anywhere between 5 and 20% of a campaign's funding, depending especially on the candidate's connections and PAC interests. Super PACs are a particular kind of political action committee. Unlike traditional PACs, super PACs cannot directly donate to a candidate or party and are prohibited from coordinating messaging or strategizing with campaigns. However, their activities are not subject to normal campaign finance laws, and as a result, super PACs can spend unlimited amounts of money and can engage in unlimited independent spending, normally raised from corporations, unions, and other associations. Super PACs can dominate the spending landscape in high-profile races, especially in presidential and competitive Senate races, but they don't contribute directly to the campaign's funds. Political parties often contribute to campaigns and are subject to legal limits. These contributions are often used to support party infrastructure, candidate development, and direct support for candidates through coordinated expenditures. Party contributions are more significant in the general election than in primaries. In general elections, party spending can amount to 5, 10, 15% of a candidate's funding, with higher figures possible in tightly contested races where party support is strong. Some candidates are also able to use their own personal funds to finance their campaigns. Self-funded campaigns are subject to different regulations, allowing candidates to contribute unlimited amounts of their personal funds to their campaigns. As a result, the impact of self-funding varies greatly. Some candidates can finance significant portions of their campaigns, while others contribute minimally. In some high-profile races, self-funding can account for the majority of a campaign's funds, but this is not typical for most candidates. In the United States, public funding is available for presidential campaigns and can come in the form of matching funds during the primaries and a fixed amount during the general election. To receive public funds, candidates must meet specific criteria and accept certain spending limits. Public funding has become less significant in recent presidential campaigns, with many candidates opting out to avoid spending limits imposed when they accept public funding. Finally, so-called dark money refers to political spending by nonprofit organizations that are not required to disclose their donors. Such spending can influence elections without direct traceability to the source of funds. These funds are not directly attributed to the campaign, but can have significant impact on the election's overall landscape. Because they're not subject to campaign finance limits or reporting requirements, determining the exact amount of dark money spent in any election is challenging. Campaign fundraising and spending is governed by a complex set of regulations and legal frameworks designed to maintain the integrity of the electoral process, regulating the sources, amounts, and transparency of financial contributions to political campaigns. The cornerstone of the modern federal campaign finance law is the 1971 Federal Election Campaign Act. This act established restrictions on contributions to federal candidates and political parties, set disclosure requirements for campaign finances, and created the Federal Elections Commission, or FEC, to enforce campaign finance laws. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, commonly known as the McCain-Feingold Act, was designed to address the rise of soft money, unregulated contributions to political parties for party-building activities, and issue advocacy ads that discuss issues but don't directly advocate for or against a specific candidate. It banned national political parties from raising or spending soft money funds and set stricter limits on issue advocacy ads. However, most of the provisions of this act were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Indeed, a variety of Supreme Court decisions have shaped campaign finance laws. The most important of these include Buckley v. Vallejo, which upheld limits on individual contributions to campaigns, but ruled that spending money to influence elections is a form of constitutionally protected free speech, striking down limits on independent expenditures and personal spending by candidates. In Citizens United v. Federal Elections Commission, the court ruled that corporations and unions can spend unlimited money on political campaigns, asserting that such spending is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. This decision struck down many of the limits imposed by the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act and led to the creation of super PACs. And McCutcheon v. FEC, which struck down the aggregate limits on how much individual donors can contribute to federal candidates, PACs, and parties in a 2-year election cycle, while maintaining the limits on contributions to individual candidates and committees. In addition to federal laws, each state has its own set of laws governing campaign finance for state elections. These can vary widely in terms of contribution limits, disclosure requirements, and other regulations. Some states like Massachusetts, Minnesota, Colorado, Connecticut, and others are known for having very strict spending limits and detailed reporting requirements, while others like Texas, Virginia, and Oregon have few, if any, limits on campaign contributions. And for what it's worth, California's campaign finance laws fall on the more restrictive side of the spectrum, with strict limits on individual contribution amounts, strong disclosure requirements for campaigns, and an independent body, the California Fair Political Processes Commission, charged with making records of contributions and spending publicly available to ensure transparency. Campaign finance reform remains a hotly debated topic in American politics, with strong arguments both for and against it. Those arguing in favor of reforming the current system argue that strict campaign finance laws are necessary to prevent corruption and the appearance of corruption. They believe that large contributions can give undue influence to wealthy donors and special interests, skewing the political process in their favor. As such, reforming the current system, especially limiting large contributions, would help level the playing field, protecting democratic principles of one person, one vote, reducing the disproportionate influence large donors might have. Further, supporters of reform often call for more robust disclosure requirements to ensure transparency in political funding, believing this will help voters make informed decisions and hold politicians accountable. Campaign finance reform is sometimes seen as a way to help empower small donors, thereby increasing democratic participation and reducing politicians' dependency on large donors. Finally, there's a concern that large donations may lead to policy decisions that favor special interests over the public good. From this perspective, reform is viewed as a means to ensure that elected officials remain accountable to their constituents rather than to their major donors. On the other hand, critics of campaign finance laws argue that political spending is a form of free speech and that restrictions on campaign contributions and expenditures are unconstitutional limits on this freedom. This is the line of argument the Supreme Court has usually followed when striking down various campaign finance restrictions. Critics also argue that past reforms have not effectively curbed the influence of money in politics, and indeed have instead often had unintended consequences such as the rise of super PACs and dark money. Further, opponents point out that campaign finance laws can be exceedingly complex, making compliance difficult and enforcement inconsistent. They argue that this complexity can disadvantage small, less well-funded campaigns and grassroots movements, thereby hindering rather than promoting political competition. Finally, there's also a concern about government overreach, with critics arguing that too much regulation in the realm of campaign finance can give the government excessive control over the political process. The debate over campaign finance reform in part reflects deeper philosophical divisions about the nature of democracy, the role of money in politics, and the balance between free speech and the prevention of corruption. But they also implicitly raise the question about whether or not campaign donations actually affect public policy. That is, do donations ultimately buy votes? And while the popular perception is that legislators sell their votes to the highest campaign donors, the reality is more complicated than that. There's considerable evidence that large campaign donors are often buying access to candidates. Donors who contribute significant amounts of money to a campaign almost always gain more opportunities to meet with the legislators, lobby their interests, and influence policy indirectly through these interactions. But the evidence on actual buying of votes is much less clear. A more likely explanation is that of alignment of interests. That is, donors contribute to candidates whose views already align with their own, rather than making donations to change a candidate's position. In this sense, donations may be more about supporting like-minded individuals than buying votes. Think of it this way. A group lobbying to protect Second Amendment gun rights is far more likely to donate to a candidate who has a track record of supporting such rights than to one who argues in favor of stricter gun control laws. Just as a group that favors stricter environmental regulations is more likely to donate to campaigns of candidates who favor such policies than those who oppose them. And this is why we can often see clear partisan differences in the groups and industries donating to one party's candidates over another's over time. For example, the Democratic Party and its candidates receive large campaign donations from labor unions, environmental groups, the technology sector, lawyers and law firms, and the educational sector, while the Republican Party and its candidates receive much of their campaign donations from the oil and gas industry, the financial sector, the real estate industry, defense contractors, and the pharmaceutical industry. When we see this, it makes sense. Labor unions and educators are not donating money in hopes of directly buying Democratic votes on issues they care about, just as the oil industry and the pharmaceutical industry are not making campaign contributions in hope of buying Republican votes. Rather, they're giving money to candidates who already are favorably disposed to the policies that align with their interests in hopes of getting them elected to office because they're already supportive of the group's overall goals. The directional arrow, in other words, does not flow from donation to support, but from support to donation, as is commonly thought. That is, campaign contributions are not an effort to buy a legislator's vote. Rather, the arrow goes the other direction. A legislator's vote, or more broadly their ongoing support for a particular issue or perspective, leads the group to donate to their political campaigns. There are other reasons to think that this is the case. There are normally multiple influences on decisions, such that legislators are influenced by a range of factors including their personal beliefs, party positions, constituent opinions, and expert advice. The complexity means that campaign contributions are just one of many influences on their decisions. Further, directly exchanging campaign contributions for votes is illegal and can lead to serious legal consequences. Most politicians are aware of these boundaries and endeavor to avoid crossing them. Finally, elected officials are under constant scrutiny from the media, their constituents, and their political opponents. Blatant quid pro quo arrangements would likely be exposed and end their political careers. As a result, research suggests that changing a legislator's vote through contributions alone is challenging, especially on high-profile issues or those that conflict with the legislators or their constituents' deeply held beliefs. Rather, campaign contributions operate in a more subtle manner, reinforcing existing alliances, ensuring sustained access to policymakers, and signaling to legislators the importance of certain issues to their donors. While this exact impact can vary widely depending upon the context, the individual legislator, and the nature of the issue or the political environment, it's rarely as simple as just buying votes. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.